Behind me now is the reconstructed Fort Phil Kearny, which lasted from 1866 to 1868. And I made a misstatement over at the Fetterman Massacre site. This was to protect people heading not to California, but to the gold fields of Montana. And it only was used up until 1868 because eventually the railroad actually stretched far enough to allow miners to make it over to Idaho, and they could easily hike to Montana. But the thing with this fort was the Native Americans allowed it, but they started referring to it as the hated post on the Little Piney because as a part of the allowance of the Bozeman Trail coming through, the Lakota and the Crow and the Cheyenne had agreed to no settlement in their land. And when people began settling in their land, they said, oh, well, America violated the treaty first, so Red Cloud led his people against the trail in the Fetterman Massacre and the Box Wagon Fight. And the Box Wagon Fight was the turning point of the war at which we actually began gaining a foothold. After the Fetterman Massacre, I should have specified, we moved our troops out for a good period of time and said we can no longer stay here, it's basically yours. But we retook the fort and we met them at the Wagon Box Fight, which I'll show you in a minute. But this is, it was later abandoned with the railroad and burned down by Cheyenne in 1868, later to be reconstructed here as kind of a tourist attraction. So after the Fetterman Massacre, they were buried here, and then the 3 from the Wagon Box Fight were also buried here, as well as a few others from other incidents and conflicts around with Red Cloud's War. But in 1896, they were all exhumed and buried at the Custer Battlefield National Monument. And if we pan over, we will see Pilot Knob, which was used to signal when the massacres were taking place. They kind of saw it from over the hill directly behind us, and the fort itself is right here. And it was a subject of constant raids and attacks because Red Cloud's War was not a war of regular warfare, but kind of attack and skirmish as people were out and about. From this hill in remote Johnson County, Wyoming, the largest victory of the Oglala Lakota people was achieved on December 21st, 1866. This was part of the Fetterman Massacre and Red Cloud's War, and this is often very overlooked when you consider the later Battle of Little Bighorn, which was larger than this. But during this massacre, John Fetterman, who was a captain, and 81 of his soldiers were killed. And the story would go that Fort Phil Kearny, which is only about 10 miles that away, was a post on the Bozeman Trail. Very dangerous trail for pioneers to come up through this county, through Wyoming, up through Montana, and to the California gold fields. And initially they had promised the Lakota people that they would have a good deal of protection. They had promised that we wouldn't settle in the area, but we broke those promises as we often did with the Native Americans, and so the Lakota felt obligated to fight back. And so Red Cloud was the main leader of this war, but you also had Crazy Horse, who distinguished himself in these battles, and you had a man by the name of Man Afraid of His Horses. So before the battle, and this is why the Lakota people called this the Battle of the Hundred in the Hands, if you want to pan over there, before this battle began, there were warriors assembled, probably several hundred of them, from the Lakota tribe, and they teamed up with the Cheyenne and a few other tribes in the area, and they brought out, I believe their name was a Windkay, and the Windkay was a two-spirit, and they believed the two-spirits to have immense spiritual and warfare power. These were gender non-conforming people, and the Windkay, the most powerful of the Lakota, rode up and down this hill 4 times, gathering in front of these warriors in a prophetic manner, in a crazed manner on his horse, people in his hands. He said, I have 100 soldiers in each hand, or rather they said, I have 100 soldiers in each hand, blue-coated soldiers. And they figured that this would be good medicine to lead them to victory in this battle. And so Crazy Horse, to a detachment of these soldiers coming up, 81 led by John Fetterman, Crazy Horse sees him coming and rides up over this hill and fires a few shots at them, gets them to come up over the hill, and they are met by hundreds of Native Americans riding on the other side of this ridge. And up on top of the hill here is where the massacre itself happened.
And then you go up the stairs, we've got Town Barn, the carriage house, and the cattle war is going to be the green gallery right through those doors. All right?
As the Fetterman Massacre was unfolding, a Portuguese immigrant, who is now known as Portuguese Phillips, was observing from Pilot Knob, right up overlooking the site now. And when he saw this happening, he realized if these 81 men died, that left most of the fort undefended and most of the Bozeman Trail completely open. And so when the massacre happened, the Native Americans fell back to the fort and began laying siege to it. And in sub-zero weather on December 21st, Portuguese Phillips rode his horse 236 miles south to Laramie and to the barracks there to get help for Fort Phil Kearny. And this was the only thing that actually saved the fort from total destruction and being overrun by the Lakota and Cheyenne. After the Native American victory over Fetterman's force of 81 men at the Fetterman Massacre, which is visible just behind the cameraman now, they decided to have the annual Sundance ceremonies a little bit further away. And it was decided here that they would form an alliance with the Cheyenne and a few Arapaho to come down, and it was led by Chief Red Cloud and Chief Hump. And they decided that they were going to launch a very similar attack on a party of about 50-something people and a number of civilians, just again a few miles away from Fort Phil Kearny, as they were trying to cut down some trees and get the wood. And they had a wagon box set up. They set their wagons in a circle, which could easily be defended. That was standard practice at the time. And actually, I'll walk over this way now and show you where this would have been. And when the fighting began, most people ran for the hills, and about 23 people were holed up in an area this small. And it was said that the fight would have gone the way of the Lakota as they had massacred men at Fetterman's Hill over there. But because the men at Fort Phil Kearny had breech-loading Spencer rifles, they were able to hold off wave after wave of attack from Red Cloud. And eventually, hours later, a reinforcement group arrived from Fort Phil Kearny, relieved them, and they waited until nightfall because men, if you want to pan the camera around, men ran off into the wood line there and they were saved. And in total, only about 3 soldiers and 3 civilians, because they had civilian contractors, they were the ones who died in the massacre. Now, this could have gone the opposite way and they would have killed, you know, all of them, as they did at Fetterman's Massacre. But because of the Spencer rifles, they came out successful. Now, this was, consider 23 men versus estimates of 1,000 Lakota warriors. And with the superior rifles, they won out.